All right, welcome to the Saugus Historical Society. We're going to start with the Pledge of Allegiance, and the flag is right here behind us. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Welcome to the first meeting of the fall season. Tonight we're continuing our discussion of events that happened during World War II. We had several great talks in April, and tonight we have Jack Klecker talking about the Navy, and there's some of his material right there, and about John Howard Current, who graduated from Saugus High and went into the Navy during World War II. And then we'll have Bill Stewart talking about growing up in Saugus during those turbulent years and all the changes that it brought to civilian life. Without much further ado, I will introduce Jack. Jack Klecker is one of our board members, and most of you do know him from various places around town. Jack?
Thank you. Hello, and welcome to all. My name is Jack Klecker. I'm a Navy veteran, and today we're going to talk about World War II and the Navy. And of course, you all know about World War II. It happened in both the Pacific and in the Atlantic. And of course, the biggie in the Pacific was December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor happened. And of course, that started a war for the Pacific. But in the interim, while that started, we had a big war going on in the Atlantic. And in the Atlantic, of course, Europe, and in particular England, were being attacked by the Germans, and who eventually took over France and Italy, and so they had to be stopped. And eventually the United States participated in that war. And in the beginning, Russia was also participating in it, and they were our friends at the time. And in the beginning, all the war supplies that were being sent over to help England and Europe had to go across the Atlantic. And of course, the Germans had hundreds of submarines out there, and they were torpedoing these freighters and sinking them. And that's where the Navy came in. My favorite ship, the destroyers over here. I was on two of them. The picture of the Charlie Roan on the first one here. The middle one was the USS Sampson. I was a plank owner on that, built her up in Bath, Maine. And the model there was built by a Boston firefighter that retired and gave it to me. And that's one of the original World War II single barrel, single firing destroyers. And of course, we had sonar on the destroyers, so we'd send them out into the Atlantic where they could hear underwater and get a fix on the submarines that were in the area when we were sending ships and war supplies over. And with any kind of luck, we'd get the information out to the other ships and drop hedgehoggers and try to blow the subs up before they exploded one of our ships. And so our biggest battle was with the Germans, with the submarines. And them submarines, some of them, believe it or not, got in as close as New York Harbor. So it was touch and go. And I mentioned that we had freighters that came over with war supplies, even from Russia, where our friends were at the time. Well, some of the sailors that joined the Coast Guard or the Navy at that time, when we had these merchant ships, we put a 5-inch gun on the bow and took some of the sailors or Coast Guard boys and put them on to man them guns. And one of the ships, it was a Russian ship, had a Saugus boy on it. This picture's up here. Jan Curran graduated from Saugus High School. And he manned one of them guns on one of them Russian ships during World War II. He was in the Navy for manning them things for 4 years. And he also got a medal, Medal of Honor from the Russian government for helping protect their ships. So that was one of our high school boys that went in the Navy in World War II. Thank you.
This is a picture of one of his identification papers and the medal that he got.
Yep.
And also a commendation certificate. And I will have Bill start in a minute, but I wanted to show you what was then Saugus High School. We've been having trouble these last few years when I say the old Saugus High School, or when anybody says it. We have to figure out which old Saugus High School we're talking
Gene
about.
and I went there.
Okay. I think there probably are a few people here.
Sure.
My mother went to the old high school as opposed to the new old high school. Okay. Bill, want to tell us?
Yeah, it was a quiet Sunday afternoon. My father and I, we were in the den. My father reading the Sunday paper. I was reading a comic book. My mother was in the kitchen. She was putting together the Sunday supper. We kept the radio on in the den when we were reading every night, and usually on low volume so as not to interfere with our reading. Suddenly, about 5 p.m., we heard, "We interrupt this program to report that the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii." This was December 7th, 1941, and so began World War II. For those of you too young, that don't include Eugene, to have lived through it, I'll tell you a story from the home front. In school, we were given folders where we could place dimes, which were collected into the unit, and then they were forwarded from the school to the federal government. They used them to produce the little. It was $18.75 in the unit that we put in, and for that we got a $25 scholarship. Not scholarship. Yeah, a payment for a five-year payment. It would be. Some of the things my mother would form Merlin's Market, which down on Central Street. And her list of purchases, she told him what she wanted, and then I'd go down the hill and get it. I lived at the top of Cliff Hill, Henshit Mountain, they call it. It's across from the school on Hurd Street. That big cliff that goes way up, I lived on the top. So my mother wouldn't go down shopping. I went shopping. Of course, I was only 7 years old when the war started, so it was easy for me. So I'd get the items from Merlin's Market. And certain of the products were very short supply. Mr. Merlin would put some of the things like sugar and coffee and meats that you called in. He put them under the counter, so that normal people walking in wouldn't see any of that. They wouldn't know it because everything was short. So he wanted to make sure that the people that shopped there got exactly what they wanted. And the only way to do that was deny it to other people. It wasn't on the racks, you couldn't see it, but we could get it. Okay. Children were given pieces that had small round slots in them for the dimes. So you'd put the dime in. It was about the size of this, and it had the dots for $18.75. We faithfully placed our dimes, and when the board was full, we turned them in to the teacher, and eventually the federal government that wanted them to use gave us $18.50, and then we'd get a certificate which would place in 5 years. Food was usually what we think of when we think of wartime, restraining through many of the print is very small in this, and my eyes aren't that large. Certainly it affected every American every day, so perhaps this isn't a surprise. There were several factors as to why food was rationed during World War II, including supply and demand issues, activity needs, military needs, and the economy itself. Well, demand has been building for prior years, and the U.S. joined the war. Demand for materials and supplies skyrocketed. Couldn't have tin cans anymore. They needed the tin for materials in the military. So tin cans were very, very hard to get. Some of the others are coffees, cooking sills. Sugar was targeted. You couldn't get sugar. You usually got the substitute. And the same thing with butter. Butter, we got oleo. And it had the little chip in it, and you'd mix it, and it would turn yellow. But it was white when we got it. These guys, like him, they were in before me, and they were on ships where the stuff was good. So that he had good stuff. I had oleo. Okay, across the U.S., agricultural workers were drafted into the military and moved to industrial centers to work. At the same time, the need for food was booming. America was both arsenal and the breadbasket of democracy. In response, the government formed the Crop Corps, the Women's Land Army, established the program, and they leaned out and encouraged citizens to join in building the victory gardens, they called them, to provide their own produce so that the produce could be used by the military that they needed all over the world. Rationing was overseen by the Federal Office of Price Administration. Now, we had interest books that said that we could get this and we could get that, but only a certain amount, and you could only get what you had in the book. Now, books were built by the number of people in the family. So if you had a very large family, you got a lot of food. A lot of the special stuff, like sugar. If you were by yourself, you got one. To buy ration foods, shoppers had to produce the right ration stamps for coupons, plus monetary cost of the item, which not to succeed the government's set pricing. To control the rate of spending, speeding and discharge, like I say, it's very small print. Discourage hurting of products. Ration coupons and stamps were only as good as a certain periods of time. So that you got a stamp for a year, and at the end of the year you had to go back and get another batch of stamps to serve you for the next year. Throughout the war, the OPA added and removed things from the ration list as needed. They also adjusted price values, sealing the prices and the amounts of coffee and sugar per person. The ration books, There were 5 that were printed over the 5 years, and 4 issued. Ration Book 5 was printed in 45, but the war ended and it was not issued. Ration cards were also issued to Mexican nationals along the border who wanted to purchase food in the United States. Every food rationed on the point system was assigned a point value by the government. The number of points needed changed relatively frequently based on supply, demand, region, and economic factors. These changes were published in newspapers, and the radio across the country would print them out, and they put together the changes, the charts. I'm sorry I don't have the pictures, but they'd have all that in the newspaper, so you knew at what times you could buy, what you could buy, what you couldn't buy. Among the rationed foods, sugar, from May 1943 through June 1947. After the war, it was still hard to find. Coffee. Coffee from November 42 to July 43. Couldn't get coffee. Coffee comes from South America. Well, the Germans had the subs all over the place, all the way from South America areas right up to, like you said, New York City. Actually, they went even further up into Maine. But because of that, they couldn't get coffee very often. They'd sink the ships before they even got there. Processed foods, canned, frozen, dried, or otherwise, were packaged. Over 300 processed foods were rationed beginning in May 43 and lasting through August 1945. By rationing processed foods, scarce metals needed for tin cans were preserved, and foods were prioritied for the military use. The military needed a lot of food no matter where they were in the world, because wherever they went, if they were in battle, food wasn't available. Only the kit that they were given, the K-ration kit. If they happened to be in an area that, like England, then they could get food fairly simply. But in France, it was almost impossible. My uncle served in the Battle of the Bulge, my Uncle Jim. And he fought through he came in through the middle of the battle and fought through the end of it. When they finally broke up the German forces in the Battle of the Bulge, they moved him up to Norway. They moved a lot of the troops around different places like Sweden and so forth. And they were there to protect the people because there were still Germans, troopers, located in all these areas. When he got up to Norway, as he told me later on, the youngest ones were about 14 or 15. The older ones were about 65, and there were no German soldiers between the two groups, between 15 and 65. They were old men. That's all Germany had left. Cheese and canned milk. Fats were important. Fats were needed because the military was using certain of the chemicals for weapons, so that you couldn't get very much in the fat. They wanted us to save grease for the same reason. They needed grease for the weapons. You couldn't fire a rifle very long without some way of cleaning it. Women's got stockings. Both nylon and silk were collected by the government for military areas. Silk had been imported from Japan, so we weren't able to get it very well on the import. The government collected dogs to assist the military. They collected binoculars because binoculars were impossible to get. They were manufactured in Germany. How are you going to get a ship to go to Germany, get binoculars, come back to New York? Couldn't do it. That is about it. You have any questions about? I lived through that. I was 7 years old when it started, but it was an experience. We'd, like I say, we'd go down and we'd shop, and you hoped that they had what you wanted. Quite often they didn't. You went without, and like I said, yeah.
Did you have a victory garden?
No.
Because people did use those.
Yes, they did.
Stuff.
Victory gardens were
And
prominent.
They canned with
But you
them?
had to have a lot of field to be able to do that. Your canned goods were very, very tight because
So
the
they-
government needed that tin badly.
So they changed to glass and the canning started that way?
No, they had a lot of cardboard packages where you'd have to water them to get the soups together. Because you had this little box, and sort of like they do with cereals today. You know, you pour it out, you put something in it, and you eat it. Well, that's what it went. It was a different life than you see today.
I had a big victory garden. I come off a dairy farm in Wisconsin.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Bill,
Did you have a car?
Yes.
were there protests across the United States against the war, like there would be?
There was early,
Or
yeah.
was everybody on board?
Of course, I was 7 years old in the beginnings, so I didn't hear too much of it, but I remember they did have trouble down in the New York area because in Pennsylvania, the western part of Pennsylvania where the Amish are, because the Amish didn't want to have anything to do with the war.
Yeah.
In fact, they repulsed being inducted into the military.
All right.
The military had to go and grab them to bring them in, and then they'd get out if they possibly could.
Sure.
Another interesting thing, I was told, I can't recall who told me now, but down in New Jersey, where they have all these fields, you know, growing vegetables and so forth, they were running out of people because the men were going into the military and the women were going into the places like GE to do the work that the men had done earlier. So they finally figured out the easiest way to do that was to take these German prisoners, and they imported the prisoners that they collected in France and the other nations there, brought them over to the U.S. on ships into New Jersey, and they did the farming. The government wasn't too accurate on keeping them. Very few of them lasted till 45. Most of them escaped and got to different parts of the country and became citizens. Yeah.
Bill, I grew up in a veterans housing project that was built after the war, and it was all veterans and their families. And what you're talking about was held over. I mean, I was born in 49, but I can remember canned milk. Absolutely. I never knew people put real milk in their coffee. We only had canned milk at
Yep.
home. Sugar very sparingly, and almost every family, we had nice big yards, almost every family had a garden. So I'm wondering if that's carryover from
Oh, sure.
the way they were
It took a
living
long time for the
beforehand.
U.S. to readjust
Yeah.
to the end of the war. The war destroyed everything. Yeah, automobiles were almost impossible to get.
Did you have a car? Did your family have
My father had a car, but he had a tough time getting gas.
How much was gas during that time?
I've got no idea. I was 7.
He was 7.
Not a big problem to me. Bicycles were important too. You couldn't buy them. The only thing was people that already had bicycles, and the army was asking people, please turn in your bicycles, but we need them in the military.
I will.
Somebody over here had their hand up.
Yeah.
I too grew up in the projects and the veterans projects, and actually, my father was in the Navy. But more importantly, when did you as a country, did we realize what was going on with the Holocaust? When was that brought to the forefront?
After the war, Eisenhower put a lot of effort into it. He took people, German people, and marched them through, so they had to see what had gone on. That must have been awful to them.
Yeah.
If I may, Bill?
Yes.
Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, he was the five-star general that ran the European, all right? If it wasn't for the fact that he ordered that they filmed everything that went on in those concentration camps, this time of this day and age that we live in now, people say that never happened. So, and people like anybody that grew up in a veterans project, we used to call them, they know the stories because they probably heard their parents talking about those kinds of things. But Eisenhower was the one that
Yep.
he made sure that everything was filmed. Very smart man for that.
Yep.
Anyway, sorry.
No, that's good.
I will leave lots of time for questions at the end, both here and when we go back to the food. But there were a few things I wanted to mention, and even before the program started, some people had personal histories that they wanted to share. Just touching on the man that Jack brought up, John Current, right here. Someone sitting in this room was related to him. He was the uncle by marriage to Arlene Deckero, sitting in the back of the room. And she passed along some papers that were connected with his period of service. I can just read a little bit about what he did. The thaw in relations between the Soviet Union and the United States against the common enemy of Nazi Germany brought about the little-known event of the exchange of military orders and medals between the two nations. Most commonly known were the awards bestowed in the field by the Soviets on the members of the U.S. Army during the days following the May 1945 victory over Germany. They didn't always recognize each other's medals. Pertaining to John Current, he was serving as the armed guard officer on the SS Exford, as I think Jack said, during convoy PQ-18. As soon as it gets dark, he wrote in his journal, the alarms went off, and about 15 minutes later the fireworks started. Big bombers were all over, dropping incendiary bombs and some heavy bombs. They drop many flares around us to light up the area for a target. They circle around our docks and encircle us with flares and things that don't look so good. Or things don't look so good because of all that, I guess I should say. They circle around our docks, and some bombs drop nearby, but no serious damage was done. As we stand on the decks at our gun stations, we get hit by falling shrapnel, and it can be heard dropping on the sheds, dock, and on our steel deck. Very loud on the steel deck, I'm sure. Some pieces are quite big and would injure a person if hit directly. On September 30th, he recorded, Archangel seems to be the place that has to take it. Many fires were started, and it looks like the whole city is ablaze. About 6 small blocks have been burned in the residential district and about the same amount in suburban districts. Some houses were directly hit by big bombs and were leveled out over the landscape. Not a very pretty sight. I'm not sure where Archangel is. They arrived back in New York on January 31st.
Archangel is Russia.
Russia.
Northern part.
Okay. 1943.
They were transporting, U.S. was transporting military stuff up over into that area because that was the only way they could get to the Russian troops to supply them.
Yeah, okay. They arrived back in New York January 31st, 1943. John Current was then, at that point, a boatswain's mate, second class, transferred to the SS Stephen T. Mather, a new Liberty ship, for the remainder of the war. I think we figured out that he graduated from Saugus High in 1936,
That'd be about right, yeah.
because I was looking for a picture in the yearbook. And at the Historical Society, we do have 37 and 38, but not 36. So I still plan to go to the library and see if they have that particular yearbook, and maybe we'll find a little bit younger picture of him. John Current was one of the 217 recipients who the USSR recognized for the thousands of brave men who sacrificed their lives and freedoms to participate in convoys and other duties, along with the Russians at that period of time.
One other thing I'd like to mention too. I served in the Army, Army security, and I served in Japan for 2 years. My father, you can't go there. Worse than that, my wife, our first son was born while I was at training out in the western part of the state. And she couldn't, because of the baby, she couldn't come over until he was 6 months old. And her father kept telling her, you can't go to Japan, those people will shoot you. Well, Japan was, by the time I went there in 58, I was here 58 and 59, it was very complacent. They liked us. One of the things they liked about us, well, the groups like me, there were about a dozen of us. There were only 50 of us in the whole camp, but a dozen of us were married and had our wives there. So we all had Japanese women, because the Japanese women needed jobs badly. You know, a lot of the younger men had gone. They were destroyed in the military. So just about every one of us had a woman in there that would come in and work. She gave me trouble because in Army security we worked 3 days on day shift. We had 2 days off. And then we worked 3 days on the mid shift and had 2 days off. And then we worked 3 days in the final one from midnight to 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. And because of that, I'd have to try to sleep, you know, after when I got home at 8:30 from the base. I'd have to sleep, and she'd be in there scrubbing the stuff and doing all kinds of things in there. And I'd say, shut up.
I also wanted to pass out an article written by one of our other board members, Joni Albee, who couldn't be here tonight, and I think there's enough copies to go around. This was in the Saugus Advocate on February 9th this year, and the second page is a smaller page because it's just the continuation. This is about the 4 chaplains. Has anybody heard of the 4 chaplains?
Oh, sure.
Okay. Several people, I'm sure, have. Let's see.
What ship did the 4 chaplains
I'll say
go
a
down
little
in? Do you
bit more
remember?
about them in a minute. Just, but I did want to show you a few pictures from the high school yearbook during the war years, because that's one way that we can look back and see some of the things that were going on. Bill was younger and would have noticed certain things. Probably a lot of this, when you're 7 years old,
Yep.
you don't really remember things being different.
I was 11 though.
Oh, 11.
Well, later on,
Okay,
when
yes, that's right.
they were still
the
fighting.
The older you get, the more things you realize.
Yep.
And your parents are probably saying, it wasn't like this before the war.
Yeah.
Paul mentioned the rationing of gasoline, which was used by the military, so that limited what people could do, how people could get around, how much they could travel, etc. If you were in high school, Certainly, the 1941 yearbook, if you remember back to your high school days, the yearbook is actually printed before the end of the year. So it didn't say very much about the war. It hadn't really reached us yet. But the 42 yearbook, all of the pictures, all of the sketches in between the pages, the chapter headings show military uniforms. People are talking about many of the young men, as they graduated, would be going into the war, were planning to join the military, and some were drafted, but many of them were going voluntarily. And it wasn't just the students. If you look at the picture up here, this was from the 42 yearbook, and these are 4 of the high school faculty who were among the first from our town to go out and fight in the war. At least one of them is probably familiar to a lot of people. John Burns, in the Navy, up in the upper left corner of that picture. He wrote a couple of books about Saugus history, and since you are all interested in history here, I bet a few of you have his books in your
He was my
in your homes.
instructor
He was your instructor.
in English, yeah.
Okay, yes, that's right. He taught English for many, many years, and came back from the war and continued to teach English in Saugus High School. So some of you might remember. What? You had him too. Yeah.
Because I graduated in 1964.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I had Mr. Burns for my teacher, one of my teachers. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So a lot of much younger people would recognize him too from that photograph. And then several other teachers are up there who were teaching in the schools at that particular time. Here's one of the chapter pages in the 42 yearbook showing seniors, and they're in their graduation gowns, some of them, and then behind them is a soldier and a woman in an army, looks like army uniform, because women were serving in various capacities. My mother was in a civilian Air Corps, I think it was called. Does that sound right? Okay.
Yep.
So it doesn't mean that she flew the planes, but she was supposed to be able to recognize airplanes by their silhouettes, much the way that a lot of us try to recognize birds, hawks, and eagles by their wingspans and shapes.
There were women pilots too.
Yes,
they
that's true.
transport
Yeah.
military supplies and weapons and so forth from the Midwest to both California and New York to be shipped overseas.
Right.
In those days, we didn't use airplanes to transport stuff. It was ships.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
More than that, to put a point to it, as the airplanes were being built,
yeah.
the women pilots
Right.
flew them over to Europe,
Yep.
handed them over to the whichever program was going to use them. Very quiet about that. Nobody talks much about it, but it's a lot of things they did to women.
Yeah.
Some of them were shot down trying.
Absolutely right, yes.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. And many of the students envisioned their future after graduation as having a connection to the war in one way or
They
another.
didn't have much choice.
Well, exactly. And there were also some new clubs in the school, so even people who hadn't graduated yet and who were still pursuing their regular studies. The Defense Stamp Collectors Club, which seems to be both men and women, but mostly women in this picture up above. That's the Saugus High 1942 yearbook, and it had students from freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors could all belong to that. Oh, okay, I guess that's the last picture over there. Now, Arlene isn't the only person who had an uncle serving in World War II in this room. World War I. Okay, I will let people look at this. Diana brought this in and shows some of the medals that her uncle won in World War I. Yes, that's true. The uniform is a little bit different.
He fought with Logan, Logan Airport.
Logan Airport. Okay. Yep. Good. So the four chaplains story is about the four religious men on, not that other people were not religious men necessarily, but the four people who were charged with helping with all of the naval officers on the ship, the Dorchester, during World War II. It was torpedoed and it sank. They knew they were in dangerous waters, and it happened during the night. They didn't have enough life jackets for everybody. They didn't have enough lifeboats for everybody. So they knew as the ship was sinking that not everybody was going to make it. So the four chaplains all agreed among themselves that they were going to give up their life jackets and their place in the boats to other men. So there is a ceremony every year held in different veterans organizations halls to remember them. And it happened, it was February when it happened. So many of the people who had life jackets still didn't survive because they froze in the water being cold in February. But this article that was written by the Historical Society Secretary, Joni Albee, tells a little bit more about it. And I was talking to my husband about the incident. He recalled some additional information. There were 902?
902
Okay.
It was a converted passenger liner that had been converted to a troop transport. And it was taking 900, well, there was 902 included the crew, but it was taking these troops to Greenland. And it was in a convoy, and the convoy was attacked. This is like February 4th, I think. And their ship was torpedoed. And the captain of the ship had warned all the men that they should sleep in their clothes and keep their life vests on, but a lot of them didn't. And when the ship was torpedoed, the electrical system went out, so they were in the dark. And they were trying to get their life preservers. They were trying to get in the lifeboats and stuff in the dark, while the ship was burning and sinking. And as Laura said, the ocean temperature was 34 degrees. So when you're in 34-degree water, you've got about 15 minutes.
I'll read their names. Let's see. Take me a minute. Oh, Chaplain George L. Fox, a Methodist minister. Chaplain Alexander D. Good, a rabbi. Chaplain John P. Washington, a Catholic priest. Chaplain Clark V. Poling, minister of the Reformed Church. Recently, another man from that ship has been mentioned in the memorial service that's held every year. Coast Guard sailor Charles Walter David Jr. He rescued two of his shipmates and those who were victims of the torpedoed Dorchester. He was a Coast Guard steward's mate first class, and he escorted a convoy of 3 ships, Escanaba, Tampa, and troop transport in the North Atlantic, near Newfoundland. So it was colder waters than we're accustomed to trying to swim in on New Year's Day, or any of the things that people might do around here. Did everybody get a copy of this? Okay. Oh, no. Okay. I thought I had. Woo.
These four chaplains were nominated for the Medal of Honor, but the nomination was rejected because the Medal of Honor can only be given to combat troops. And this was actually a sore point during the Second World War. They introduced the infantry combat badge, and people got combat pay. But there were people like chaplains and medics who were dying in combat and weren't entitled to combat pay.
Okay. I promised there would be time for questions and telling stories. First, I'd like to hear from any of you who had a relative serving in World War II. Okay. Ruth?
My husband, Dan Bird, was in the Navy. He was on the battleship Nevada, which was the only ship that got underway after Pearl Harbor.
Oh.
They were hit, but they were able to go away. So they sent the ship to Fargo Building in Boston, and that's when it was there being repaired. That's when he was old enough to be drafted, because he wasn't on the ship in Pearl Harbor, but he was assigned to it when they gave him a mistake. And the ship's headquarters was actually in the state of Washington, so he was there. But that ship went from was the oldest ship in the Navy at the time. So they really put it in harm's way all the time. Let that one go. So he was in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Has 7 major battles he was in.
Wow.
It was never hurt, very fortunately. But he saw a lot of action, a lot of problems. And the closest he got was the Marines. The guns on the ships were only manned by the Marines. So he was one of his jobs was loader. So he would load the machine gun, but the Marines shot it. And so a Japanese kamikaze plane would come down. And there's so many Japanese that killed themselves for the war. It was amazing. They took jobs where they absolutely committed suicide. And he looked up and he saw the plane coming right at him. He literally saw his name, he said, right across the plane. But the Marine hit the plane and it knocked it over to another part of the ship where 17 sailors were just up there watching the action, and they all got killed. So he got very close. That was something that was very traumatic for him. I didn't know about it for years.
Yeah.
Because he always saw that plane, and he says that was the end of him. But fortunately, he wasn't.
Right.
But that ship went on, and he was in every single major battle. And he would say, "Oh, we went to Washington D.C. and we see the replica of Iwo Jima." And he says, "That's a phony picture." And I would listen to him, what's he talking about? And find out he literally saw the picture taken twice. Because the first scene and I says, "You were never on the land." He says, "Everything was flat. We could see everything right from the ship." So he watched them raise the flag on one part, and they realized it wasn't on a hill high enough, so they took it again. And then years later, we heard about it, and we all laughed because he was telling us that for years.
Okay.
So he had a lot of interesting things, but he saw every single major battle, and was just lucky that he was never injured. But I just want to add what he did. But I was 12 years old during the war, so we were very, very patriotic. And I lived in the West End of Boston, and the Charles Bank Homes, which had 100 apartments, different sections, small apartments, but different sections. And as kids, we had a wagon, and we would bring it, and we would go around, we would collect different things for the war effort. So we would collect rubber, because rubber was very important to use in the war effort. So at every single apartment, they'd scour their house. One man says, "All I have is an eraser." But everybody had to help and give. Everything was extremely patriotic. And then we would collect jars of fat. Women saved the fat that they cooked in. You brought that to the butcher shop. That was made for something.
Right.
So we were all very, very patriotic. So there's a lot I remember about, that his ship, incidentally, after the war, we survived it, survived the whole war. He was on it for 2.5 years, from 1944 to 1946. And then it would, they threw the atomic bomb on it with a bunch of ships to get rid of them. It escaped the atomic bomb. It escaped everything. And we ended up, it wasn't until much years later we found out there were reunions, and always in California, and who could afford to go to California? But the one year we went was the greatest experience of all.
Okay.
Because they named a submarine after the Nevada.
Right.
So the gambling places in Nevada sponsored the trip. And we went, they had a tent size of a football field with the most gourmet food you ever saw in your life. Like, because they were commissioning the submarine, we were sitting, I was as his spouse then, because I didn't marry him till I was 22, he was 29, it was long after the war. But we sat on the red carpet.
Oh.
And we were first before the governors or anybody. And we went into the submarine, and we went so many floors below that nobody goes to. So we kept going down and down and down. So it was a lot of excitement. We went 40 years to reunions, practically every state in the country. And we heard the same stories over and over and over again. And they'd say, and then what happened? And they'd talk. It's like they heard it, but they relived the war every single time. And it was really great. I had a lot of experiences.
Yeah.
When you talk about soldiers that performed in World War II, in the 90s, early 90s, they captured this guy in Japan, a Japanese trooper in Japan, who had held out in the mountains for all that time. Nobody ever caught him until he finally walked into the city and said, "Here I am." He ran out of, for one thing, he ran out of bullets.
But I just want to add, the ship was torpedoed, and they could just close off that section of the ship so that it never destroyed the battleships were a city in itself, over 3,000 men. So, and then some Japanese would swim up, and they'd catch them, and then they put them in prison. And they ate the same food that we did. Took care of them. So a lot of them were extremely prejudiced against the Japanese. Because I went to Philadelphia and on a tour, and all of a sudden, here the Marines are with us and everything. The Marines hated the Japanese so badly, and all of a sudden, there's the flag, the Tokyo flag, and a whole Japanese group were coming in to see the Liberty Bell, and they crossed in front of us, and those Marines started screaming that they, how do they let them in, and I don't even know till they died. They always were very against because of the war, because they just kill you. They have no conscience. A lot of experiences. And I didn't realize that you could bring things, and I have all these medals and everything.
Okay, yeah, well, we'll put you up for the program next spring. I think we definitely have a lot of interesting stories, and a few other people were telling me about family members.
Yes, my name is Lloyd Sales, and my father was killed at the Battle of the Bulge.
Oh, yeah.
And
6 months before he was born.
Wow, yeah.
And my experiences after the fact were that the military treated my mother very well. Okay. My Nancy and I have been buried in Luxembourg.
Yeah.
And we went to the cemetery, the American cemetery, and we were treated very, very well. But my father, he joined the military in 1942 and trained in California, and he was the end of the war, December 31st, 1944. That's when it happened. So
the last letter that came through.
Yes, one of my uncles. The name is Sales. It's not in this town. It's like, I don't know if any of you know who Jim Blanchard is. Well, his mother and my father were brother and sister, and we had a whole bunch of brothers and we had a whole bunch of uncles that were in the war too. But point in fact is, no matter who you were or what you were, we need to thank God that they went and did what they did. Otherwise, we would not be sitting here tonight. Okay.
Okay.
And the cemeteries that are American cemeteries in foreign lands are well cared for by these United States of America. General Patton happens to have been buried a row over from my father, and they had to move him to the cemeteries. Think about a piece of pie.
Yeah.
Whatever your favorite kind is, and the cemeteries are set up like that, and then it's in alphabetical order. Well, so many people were coming to see General Patton. He wanted to be with his men. That's what
I remember hearing that,
the
yes.
superintendent told us. They moved him to the head of the head of the pie, the crust, if I may.
Yeah,
And it was just wonderful. It was just to be able, we were the first person to visit him in 60 years. I mean, so, but it's really close to me. Anyway,
Right.
that's my story.
okay. Anyone else who wants to mention? Okay.
My Uncle Charlie, Charles A. Glebus, Sergeant Charles Glebus, he enlisted in 1941.
Uh-huh.
And all of a sudden, he was, my mother and her boyfriend and my Uncle Charlie and his companion, they were all up in Boston Gardens. And all of a sudden they stopped the game. It was a Bruins game, and they stopped the Bruins game. And that's when, that was December 7th, 1941,
Oh,
Pearl Harbor. And they stopped the game, and they had to go to report to their station. And my Uncle Charlie was a left-wing gunner on a B-17 bomber. They used to call it the Super Bowl. And there was 16 boys, and they were they were over in Germany, and the Germans hit the fuel tank, and it went into a spin. And the only one that was able to, just the bombardier was able to escape. But the 15 boys were killed. And my grandmother, they never knew what had happened, to him.
Yeah.
And it was in 1950, my grandmother got a letter from the the government, and saying that, that they had found, they were buried, the 15 boys, because they were all burned, so the only thing was just their dog tags that gave their names. And because my Uncle Charlie was from Saugus, Massachusetts, naturally here, and Lieutenant Richard Martin was from New Jersey, so they were the only two that were from the East Coast.
Oh.
So they had to pick like a middle point on where, they could be buried. And my Uncle Charlie, there's only two graves. I was 4.5 years old when my uncle, my mother, my grandmother, and we all went to, he is buried at Camp Butler's National Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois.
Oh.
Yeah, there's two graves, because the boys, and that. And I have his Purple Heart, and I have all the letters that he wrote to my mother, every letter that he wrote to my mother. And the last letter he wrote to my mother, it was dated March 17th, 1944, and he was killed the next day, and March 18th.
Right.
March 18th. And all he ever talked about, my mother said, all he wanted to do was do his 4 years in the Army. Well, of course, at that time, it was called the Army Air Force.
Yep.
But in 1947, they dropped the Army, and it was technically called the Air Force. But my mother said that all my Uncle Charlie ever wanted to do was to fly planes. He wanted to, finish his tour of duty and come home, and he wanted to be a pilot more than anything.
A couple of years ago, I wrote that in my column, the Old Sachem, about Charlie.
Yeah, Janice Jaros, she put everything, my Uncle Charlie's picture and everything,
Yep.
and the whole story, and I and they didn't know,
Yeah.
Janice at that time, they didn't know, where the bodies were.
Yeah.
And I wrote to the, it was the Saugus Advertiser then, and I wrote saying, that the bodies were recovered,
Yep.
and they were buried in Germany until they were, brought to the United States. And they came in 1950, and that's, and it was very, very sad. I was only 4.5.
Yeah.
But I don't even have to close my eyes, and I can see that, because my uncle took us to, Camp Butler's National
Right.
Cemetery. We went till my grandmother, I was 13, and that was the last time my grandmother could make the trip. She was too frail to make the trip. But it's a beautiful, beautiful cemetery. But unfortunately, they couldn't bring him
Yeah.
here.
Well, it looks like we have one more story, and
My father was with the 82nd Airborne, and he was at St. Mary-Louise during the Normandy invasion. And his unit overshot their jump site. And there's a scene of it in The Longest Day with John Wayne, but they were getting shot down, and they were hanging from trees.
oh,
And about the 50th, fast forward now, 50th anniversary, I was reading a piece in the Globe that the GIs that made it through that were having nightmares. So I called my mother. And my mother said, yeah, he had a really bad nightmare last night. He was screaming and everything. So,
yeah. And his name was
Vincent J. Zinner.
Zinner. Okay. Thank you. All right. Anybody else have any? I'm sure just about everybody here knew someone who served during that war. And
Laura?
yes.
I feel I should say that my husband's uncle Myron was a medic, and he died on Anzio Beach.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And your husband was named for him, right?
He was my mother-in-law was pregnant at the time.
Oh.
Her brother.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
I have a memory. My father was one of 6 boys, I think, and as far as I know, they all served. But one of them died in France. But my memory is of my grandmother being a Gold Star mother,
Oh.
and I just see that every time there's a Memorial Day parade, and we still have Gold Star mothers. But I always see my grandmother sitting in the back of a convertible. It's probably the ride of her life in all
yeah.
of the.
Good memory.
Yeah, it's a good memory.
Right.
Yeah.
2 years ago, I had the honor of driving my brother-in-law's 63 Chevy convertible in the parade, and I was the driver of Gold Star Mothers.
Wonderful. Yeah.
It was quite an honor.
Yeah.
There was well, in my case, there was 8 of us were in the military. Had an uncle on an aircraft carrier in World War II, and another uncle that was in the Army. In fact, he got Purple Heart and all kinds of medals. He jumped in a foxhole on a hand grenade and saved 2 of his buddies. And he was in the hospital for about a year before they could even put him back together enough where he could survive. He lived to be 92 and retired from the railroad. But between myself, my brothers, and uncles, it was 8 of us were in the military.
Well,
I'm making a quick story because
Okay.
everybody's been telling wonderful stories. My dad enlisted in Oceanside, California. He was from California. He enlisted with his brother,
right.
2 years apart in age, and they served together until the brothers were all separated because of the Sullivan brothers. And all the brothers were my father went to the South Pacific, and my uncle went to the European theater. And what ended up happening is Ruth says, my father, the stories that I remember my father telling me, he was on a destroyer, and he was in the bowels of the destroyer. And he said one of the
Me
most
too.
frightening sounds that he would hear, he never saw the kamikaze planes, but he would hear them. He would hear the droning, and he would never know. He knew that if he would never be able to get out, even from the bowels, even if there was much of a chance. And so he said that was one of the most terrifying things. And so he loved to talk about his war stories with other veterans that have other stories, but he didn't
Yeah.
want to talk about the things that he went through too often. The same with his brother, my uncle, and they would have moments together sharing things, and probably things that they've never told any of the family. Until one day, I remember I was in I was out of high school and I was in college, and I thought I was pretty cool, and I decided I was gonna meet guys as normal. And I met this one young man, and I decided I really liked him, and I was bringing him home for a family cookout. And he said, he was visiting Boston because he was in the Navy Yard for a while. So I said, come home with me, and I'm gonna introduce you to my family. And he had another friend who decided he liked my girlfriend. So we're sitting there, we're all sitting around that barbecue, and I said, Daddy, and my father approved. I was very strict. He said, oh, this guy was in the Navy. He must be a good, okay guy. I'll let you talk with him. So they're sitting around, and I introduce them, and they're sitting, and my father says, yes. He says, I was on a destroyer, and this young man says, yeah, me too. I'm on a destroyer, and that's in dock. And my father said, I was on the USS Montreal. And this young man says, oh my God, that's my ship. Well, needless to say, I didn't have much to say to this young man or my father for the rest of the day, because they talked and they talked and they talked and they talked. And it was actually really wonderful to see that there was that camaraderie after so many years and telling the same stories, because that is where my father was discharged from that destroyer, and this young man was thrilled. So nothing ever came of my romance. But I think there might have been a bromance there between those two. And I thought it was a very odd coincidence, because my father, again, was from California, and that's where he boarded his ship. And this young man was from, I think, South Carolina, is where he boarded.
Wow.
So it's just an interesting little tale.
Yeah, all
Not
right.
necessarily about heroism, but in many ways. And the other thing I'm going to add is, hail to the women. My mother was in the USO. And she traveled around, and she was also a welder. So sometimes it's not just the men or the people that are in the military, the men of the military, all the people. It was a whole war effort, as I heard the stories from everybody.
Rosie the Riveter.
Well, I mean, we've gone quite a bit. It's 8:20 if this clock is right. But Diana had her hand up, so
I
let's.
just wanted to say, with the Ukraine and what's going on in the Middle East, and the world's so upset, I mean, we could be headed for World War III. Hopefully not, but...
Well, we all hope not.
Yeah,
But you are absolutely right. A lot of the things that are going on had some of the origins of the struggles and arguments back in World War II. So it's not like it's been forgotten by any means. So we're going to go into the other room and finish our eating in a few minutes. But just, I wanted to say that I'm sure we have enough information that sometime in the spring we'll probably have more World War II stories. And if anybody wants to suggest any to me or expand on things that you've already mentioned, I'd be happy to hear them, because we haven't set in stone any of the spring programs yet. Our November talk is still being put together, but I expect it's going to be another mini symposium on railroads and trains, both model trains and real trains from this area, and other aspects of trains, since there doesn't seem to be any lack of interest in that. definitely going to go on. And I forget the date, I don't have it with me, but it is going to be the second Wednesday of November. Our meetings are generally the second Wednesday of March, April, May, and then September, October, and November. So look forward to seeing most of you back here for the November meeting, I think. And anybody have any final comments?
Just
Okay.
thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay.